One of the oldest commentaries, written commentaries, about what we just heard, the passion and death of Jesus Christ, is found in the second reading that we heard at the beginning of this Palm Sunday Mass, St. Paul's letter to the Philippians. It was written about 30 years after the death of Christ, and it was written for a young church in Philippi. And actually, in the Greek language in which it was written, its structure indicates that it was probably a hymn that the church sang, the first Christians at Philippi. And brothers and sisters, it uses two images to comment about what we just heard in that gospel, the passion and death of Christ. The first image that St. Paul uses is he refers to the passion and cross of Christ as an emptying, a pouring out. He writes, Christ Jesus, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God something to be grasped. Rather, he emptied himself, taking the form of a slave. On the cross, Jesus empties himself of his godliness, of his stature as God, of his divinity. He becomes powerless as a slave. And he humbly accepts all the limitations of humanity, even death, and death on a cross. The cross is an act of self-emptying by the Lord, pouring out until there is nothing left. That's the first image. The second image St. Paul uses is he speaks about the Lord's obedience, accepting the will of the Father. That obedience reaches its apex, its climax, in the human death of Jesus of Nazareth on the cross, from which he is exalted and raised to life by God. Again, St. Paul writes, he humbled himself, becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. What the apostle is saying, that only after having passed through death, after death, is Jesus once again equal to God. His obedience to the plan of salvation included death on the cross. Death, the result of the sin of Adam and Eve. On a cross, the form of execution used by the Romans for non-Romans. The cross is an act of the obedience of Jesus of Nazareth to the will of the Father. Self-emptying, obedience. These are done for us, for our salvation and the salvation of all. And today, on Palm Sunday, we remember the obedience of Jesus unto the cross and his self-emptying of his divine nature. Remembering is not a trip down memory lane. That's not what we're doing here. Jesus' emptying and his obedience are loving actions. And when we remember them in the community of faith in the Eucharist, they are present. He is present. His love is present. And remembering his love on the cross makes his love alive now in each one of us, as alive as it was when it was shown on the cross. We just read the Passion according to St. Mark. St. Mark highlights Jesus' willingness to empty himself and highlights Jesus' obedience to the will of the Father. He does not resist. Very different from St. Matthew's interpretation. Rather, he accepts the inevitable result of aligning himself with his Father. And at the same time, Jesus did not allow human suffering and death to derail him from being faithful to God's plan for salvation. In this way, brothers and sisters, he becomes the model for living attuned to God. He becomes the model of facing life's uncertainties, of facing life's fears, of facing life's sufferings, of facing even death. Uncertainties, fears, suffering, and death are faced by each one of us. And reflecting on his passion, Jesus teaches us to turn to God for strength when the uncertainties, the pains, the fears, the suffering, and even death come our way. This is Holy Week. This is our week. And may our participation in it draw us into deep union with the Lord. And let us take our cue from St. Paul's words to the Philippians that we just heard in that second reading and which I have just commented on. Let us take our cue about the obedience of Jesus and the self-emptying of Jesus. I suggest to each of you, to all of us, we need to set aside some time this week, time to get yourself right with God, time to be with the crucified Lord, time to allow his example of obedience and self-emptying help you to love God and help you to be loved by God. His example of obedience teaches us about the obedience that faith demands. Our faith is tested again and again and again. It's tested from time to time. I would suggest to you that it has been severely tested during this pandemic, and especially since we are not able to gather in our churches. But may the Lord's example of self-emptying encourage us, encourage you in the self-emptying you have to do. Parents, self-empty. Grandparents, for the family, in the marriage, with your co-workers, in your jobs, in your communities. Self-emptying. And the Lord's example of obedience to the will of the Father helps us to accept the obedience that our faith requires. To Jesus Christ, who became obedient for our sakes. To Jesus Christ, who emptied himself for our sakes. To him be glory, praise, and honor forever and ever.